Cobble. Elves and the Shoemaker Retold. A Tale in the Romance, a Medieval Fairytale series. Written by Demelza Carlton. Autonarrated by AI Charlotte from Google. 1. This pair, Alba vowed, would be perfect. She used a cloth to wet the leather, just a little, not too much. Then she pressed the stamp against the smooth hide. A few gentle taps with her hammer and it was done. Now all she needed to do was paint the embossed flower so that the jewel-like colors would catch the eye of some passing lady, and yet another one of her creations would grace the king's court. They were no match for the christening shoes she'd made for the crown princess, but she'd sent them up to the palace. Once the king saw them, surely he'd declare her the royal shoemaker, as her father had been. Alba sat back and sighed. If only her father could have seen them. He would be proud. But he'd passed the previous winter, leaving her in her brother's care. As though they cared. Speak of the devil, and he shall appear. Her brother's laughing voices sounded from the street. Alba hurried to hide her embossing tools and the half-made shoe. If her brothers found the cunningly crafted flowers and other shapes, they would sell them for sure and drink the proceeds. Never mind that she needed them to make a living. She could not be the royal shoemaker if she could no longer make shoes. The bag tucked neatly into its rafter hiding spot, and the thatch smoothed into place as if it had never been disturbed. A good thing too, for her brother's good humor died the moment they entered the house. We need to go, Gad said, grabbing her arm. Where are we going? Should I pack? Alba asked. No time, Oni said, peering through the window. Jordanus has summoned the guards to evict us, and they are already on their way. Alba tore out of her brother's grasp. Why would our landlord evict us? The shoes I make earn more than enough to pay the rent. Only last week he stopped by to commission a pair as a gift to his wife for Christmas. He never mentioned you'd forgotten to pay the rent. Father left us plenty of money. Father's money is gone. We haven't paid rent since he died. And we need to go now or we'll be taken to the cells beneath the castle, where we'll die as debtors. Gad seized her arm again and dragged her from her seat. Now, Alba. We promised Father we would take care of you. Do you know what happens to women in the castle dungeons? Alba had heard all sorts of horrible stories about the dungeons, but she'd never imagined she might feature in one. No, she began. Then you don't want to find out. Come or all is lost. But my things, she faltered. Oni took her other arm and between them, her brothers dragged her to the back door. No time, Oni said. We can buy more when we are free of Jordanus and his guards. Do you want to live free or die in prison? I want to live, Alba said, risking a glance back over her shoulder at the cottage where she had spent all of her life. Without her tools, would she ever make shoes again? Then you must run. Bracketed by her brothers, Alba took to her heels, leaving behind everything else she had ever known or loved. 2. Brogan, I believe, the well-dressed man asked. I'm Jordanus. Brogan forced himself to smile, an expression that felt wrong on his face so soon after his father's death. I'm Brogan the shoemaker. I heard you had a suitable shop for rent? Jordanus' smile seemed genuine. That I do. That I do. Quite a bargain too. Shall we? He gestured for Brogan to follow him, and set off up the hill toward the castle. Plodding along behind his prospective new landlord, Brogan let out a breath he hadn't known he'd been holding. Brogan's older brother, Geryon, had inherited their father's shop. Father had left some money to help Brogan set up his own shop, provided he was far enough away from his brother not to hurt his business. Well, Brogan couldn't get much further away from Geryon than this, and still be within Casmiris. Across the river and halfway up the hill on the royal road that led from the main gate to the castle on the hill. Geryon could make boots for half the townsfolk, but if Brogan could catch the eye of some passing nobleman or woman on their way up to the castle, he could prove to himself and his family that he was just as good a shoemaker as his father and his brother, if not better. It's been vacant for some time, so it may need some repairs. I will charge you lower rent for that, of course, Jordanus said without turning around. You won't find a better location anywhere in Casmiris, of that I can assure you. Before the previous tenant died, he was the most famed shoemaker in the city. Why, he even made the king's and queen's shoes. The royal shoemaker had lived there? Brogan would be a fool to refuse. Show me, he said eagerly. Jordanus pushed open the door to a house that looked much like the others in the street. The red bricks showed a little more through the lime whitewash, true, but it was nothing a day's labor wouldn't fix. Brogan could wield a brush as well as the next man. What are you doing here? Jordanus demanded. Brogan entered the cottage just in time to see two small boys scamper out the back door. Looking for ghosts. Everyone knows this place is haunted, one boy called back over his shoulder. Jordanus laughed, pulling out a handkerchief to wipe his forehead. It was a long moment before he met Brogan's eyes. Silly boys. Children have such wild imaginations, Jordanus said. Haunted. So that was why the rent was so low. Brogan looked up, expecting to see some signs of disrepair, but the worst he saw was dust and cobwebs. Things that could be cleaned. There's a large cellar beneath the house and even a sleeping loft, Jordanus continued, pointing. The ladder to the loft didn't look too sturdy, but nor had the one he and Geryon had scrambled up to their own beds every night Brogan could remember. Are the previous tenants' tools still here? Brogan asked. He had some of his own, but Geryon had kept most of his father's things. Jordanus shrugged. Perhaps in the cellar. Brogan nodded. Perhaps was worth a hope. Once he'd made the sleeping loft and the main workroom livable, then he could tackle the cellar. Why, he could be making shoes for the king by next week. I'll take it, Brogan decided. Jordanus grinned. A wise decision. I'm sure you won't regret it. Looking around, Brogan was certain the man was right. No, not just any man. His new landlord. Brogan smiled broadly. I'll move in tomorrow. 3. Brogan had thought he'd need a handcart, but he was disappointed to discover that all of his possessions fitted into a sack. A heavy sack that took some effort to heft onto his shoulder, but a single sack nonetheless. Geryon's wife, Tihana, a quietly capable mouse of a woman, handed him a second small sack of food to take with him. She wouldn't miss him, Brogan knew. One less man to cook and clean for meant half the work. Perhaps now she and Geryon would have the children Geryon longed for. And Brogan would be able to sleep without trying to ignore their muffled fumbling in the dark, as the pair engaged in marital relations a few feet away from him. Maybe he'd have a wife of his own one day, when he had an established shoemaking business, and something to offer a girl. Right now all he owned sat in a sack that bounced uncomfortably against his back as he crossed the bridge and headed up the hill to his new home. The workroom was dim in the morning light, for the sun had not risen high enough to reach the windows yet. Brogan dropped his burden on the work table, sending up a puff of dust. The place had been deserted for some time, it seemed, judging by the thickness of the dust layer smothering everything. He would soon bring life back to the building, he swore. Something on the tabletop caught his eye. Wiping away the dust to see it better, he found 4 letters carved into the wooden surface. These weren't the work of a bored boy like he'd once been, cutting out leather for his father when he wanted to play outside. No, this was the work of an artist who wished their name remembered. Alba, he read, running his fingertips over the intricate curls of the letters as they sprouted into a flowering vine that flourished in a ring around the word. Wasn't that the name of a country far to the west, on the edge of the world? A country someone had loved enough to carve this into the table, so they might forever remember it. He hoped whoever they were, they'd made it home. He rested his hand on the table so he could reach for the bag of food from Tihana. An ominous crack sounded from under the table and Brogan jumped back. Just in time too, the legs gave way and the edge of the solid tabletop crashed to the floor where his feet had been. If he hadn't moved, his toes would have been crushed. Brogan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, but he was too hasty. The boards beneath him creaked, then squealed, as a hole appeared in the floor that swallowed the table whole and belched up a cloud of choking dust. Coughing, Brogan peered down into the cellar, where his table and his belongings now dwelled. Edging around the wall, avoiding the gaping hole he didn't want to fall into, he made his way to the cellar stairs, hoping they wouldn't break beneath him. Perhaps the place would need more work than he thought to turn it into a shop suitable for kings. No matter. He would see it through. Dreams were all good and well, but he knew it took hard work to succeed in the world, and Brogan would do all within his power to see his dreams came to fruition. But first, he had to go downstairs to retrieve his dinner. 4. Alba hid in the shadows beneath the stairs, watching the stranger. It had been a long time since she'd last heard whistling in the house, and yet that's the sound he made. The man's table had fallen through the floor, but he still managed to whistle a cheerful tune as he retrieved his things. What manner of man whistled while his house fell down around him? A mad one, that was certain. He strode up the stairs with a confident step, and only then did she see his shoes. Finely made boots over his wool hose, though both were plain. That made him a merchant or artisan of some kind, able to afford finery but without the need to wear it anywhere but his feet. A man who appreciated a pair of fine boots might not be as mad as she'd first thought. With every bit of her being, she wanted to stretch her hand out and touch the leather, to see if it was as soft as it appeared. A man who cared for his boots was a rarity indeed. Reluctantly, she restrained herself. What good would it do to reveal herself? She could not touch some stranger's boots. She hadn't touched a shoe in so long. Longer than she knew, hidden here in the dark all alone. Well, alone but for her brothers. And if her brothers had their way, she would never touch a shoe again. She sighed, slumping to sit on the dirt cellar floor. Hours later, her brothers found her under the stairs. What was all the noise then? Get asked. Alba gestured at the fallen pile of timber. The table fell apart, and the floor collapsed beneath it. Oni's teeth gleamed in the dark as he grinned. Did it really? The ghost must have unfastened the leg somehow. Ghosts didn't take apart tables. But Oni did. Alba glared at him. He continued on without a care, I wish I'd been here to see it. When the house falls down around our ears, then we'll be released from the curse. And we'll be free. Alba wasn't sure curses worked that way. What if we're trapped here, house or no house? Gad waved away her worries. We won't be. There's always a way out. Always. Don't you remember the stories Mother used to tell us? It's all about being clever and outwitting the witch. Alba racked her brain, but she could think of no story where thieves had won against a witch. Perhaps they had heard different tales to those her mother had told her, of knights and princesses and love. This man will not be so easy to frighten, she warned them. Oni laughed. What are you talking about? Of course he will be. The house is haunted as haunted can be. I heard some of the local children tell him about the ghosts here. He'll have packed up and left before the church bells ring for Sunday Mass. Alba bit her lip and didn't reply. Her brothers might be right, they usually were, but this time she hoped the man might stay. She smelled change in the air, and with it came hope. But hope for what she couldn't say. 5. Perhaps he should have apprenticed as a carpenter instead of a shoemaker, Brogan mused as he fastened his much lightened purse. Yet the new floor looked good and was as solid as the rock the castle above was built upon. A solid foundation on which to build his business. Widow the carpenter had even fixed his table for free, or so he said. The legs had somehow come unfastened, for the wood was as solid as ever, even after the table's trip to the cellar. Widow suggested some of the local lads might have done it as a prank, not knowing how fragile the floor beneath it was, and Brogan was inclined to agree. He and Geryon might have done the same thing 10 years ago, though their father would have thrashed them for it. Not wanting to cause trouble for the boys or their families, he kept quiet about it. If the boys returned, he wanted to ask more about the previous tenants, and why they thought the place was haunted. Brogan hadn't seen hide nor hair of a ghost since he arrived, though on reflection, ghosts had neither hide nor hair, so he wouldn't, would he? Brogan laughed quietly to himself as he swept the floor. The workroom was ready for him to start work tomorrow, and he'd laid up a supply of leather in preparation which he'd stashed in the cellar, out of Widow's way while he worked. He'd even found time to whitewash the walls outside. Now his shop gleamed whiter than its fellows, like fresh fallen snow. Not that there was any snow on the street to compare it to, of course. Much too early in the year. Snow rarely set in before Christmas, and that was weeks away yet. Brogan considered cutting out the leather tonight in the remaining light, but he decided he'd earned an afternoon off. It was Sunday after all, and supposed to be a day of rest. He'd go visit his brother and his wife, and see how well they were getting on without him. And get a hot meal of Tihana's cooking, for he'd sorely missed it. His own cooking skills were non-existent, and he could not yet afford a servant to do such things for him. Soon enough, he promised himself. He would sell shoes to courtiers, and no longer would he have to sweep his own floors or choke down his own burned cooking. 6. What smells of cat's piss in here? Oni asked. Now that he mentioned it, Alba smelled it too. One of the local alley cats had sneaked into the house and marked its new territory again, she assumed. I'm no cat. Gad protested. Flea-ridden rat catchers, the lot of them. He jumped on the spot a bit, and Alba realized why. You foul wretch, she cried, batting at her brother. What kind of fiend are you, relieving yourself on the floor no less? Couldn't you walk a few extra steps to a chamber pot, or even a bucket? It already smelled like that before I got to it. Gad insisted. Leather fresh from the tanner's, look. Breathing through her mouth so that she wouldn't smell the stench so much, Alba edged toward the wet sack. She nudged it open with her foot, and saw the rolled-up leather inside. Work supplies for the man who lived in the house, for she hadn't noticed them before. Curiosity ate at her. Was he a saddler or an armorer? She didn't dare hope he was a shoemaker, as her father had been. But whatever he intended to work the leather into, he must be quite the craftsman, to take a house along the royal road and all. The king and his courtiers only wanted to see merchandise fit for them when they rode along the road. Do that again and I'll empty a bucket of wash water over your head, Alba told her brother. You do that and I'll give you a hiding you won't forget, Gad growled. Don't interfere with what you don't understand. I'm only doing it to get rid of the man upstairs. If his leather is ruined, then he'll have to leave. Alba opened her mouth to remind him that no amount of piss, his or anyone's, would destroy well-tanned leather. Why the tanners used it to tan the hides in the first place. After a moment, she closed her mouth again. Perhaps her brothers didn't know. They hadn't been as eager to accompany their father to the tanners to get fresh leather to work with as she had been. They hadn't cared for his trade at all. Too busy stealing from market stalls and pulling pranks on anyone who would fall for them. If he knew you'd pissed on his leather, maybe he'd turn you out instead, Alba said. Reluctantly, she turned away from the sack of supplies and forced herself to walk away. It took every bit of her willpower not to pull out a piece of leather, and imagine what she might create with it. You've turned into a shrew, little sister, Oni complained. You're lucky you never married, or your husband would have beat it out of you. Now we're cursed to endure it." It was their own fault they were cursed, and no mistake, Alba thought but didn't say. What would be the point? They never listened to her, anyway. But when they weren't looking, she pushed the sack out of the puddle and hoped she would get to see what the man upstairs created with it. She would give anything to work with leather again. 7. The bag of leather smelt unusually fresh, but Brogan supposed it was because the stuff was fresh. He'd only bought it from the tanner yesterday. Normally, leather stayed in the cellar of his father's shop for weeks or even months before it was put to use. But here on the far side of the city, he had to find a new tanner and do business differently. Maybe a year from now, he'd have the money to stockpile stuff in the cellar. For now, he could put his reconstructed table to use as he cut boots. Brogan fell easily into a rhythm, chalking outlines for uppers and soles as he portioned the leather out into as many boots as possible. He'd bought better quality leather than his father used to work with, which meant paying more and being more careful to use every scrap. If he didn't, it could mean the difference between eating meat or cabbage next week. And Brogan had never been fond of cabbage. After he finished with the chalk, Brogan started with the shears. But the light was failing, so he only managed to cut out the pieces for 3 pairs of boots before he was forced to retire for the night. In the morning, every piece of leather was wiped clean, as though Brogan's chalk outlines had never been. But his chalk supplies told a different story. Someone was playing a prank on him, and Brogan would not stand for it. The sound of young boys' laughter outside decided him. Brogan stalked to the front door. 3 boys chased each other in the street, laughing as they eluded one another. Brogan had been good at this game, and his longer legs now gave him the advantage. He seized the first boy who came close enough, and hauled him up by the collar. "Are you responsible for this?" He waved at the work table through the open door. "Me, sir?" "No, sir. I'm not brave enough to go into a haunted house, even if they say they stayed there a whole day and didn't see no ghosts." His friends approached, though not close enough to be grabbed like their compatriot. "No, he's a fraidy cat, sir," one boy volunteered helpfully. "Have you seen the ghosts?" "What did they look like?" the other piped up. "Haunted." He'd forgotten. Brogan let his captive down gently. "If I find you boys are playing pranks on my shop, you'll regret it," he said, trying to sound frightening. 3 pairs of eyes grew wide. "No, sir, we'd never do that. The ghosts would get us. That's their shop, it is." As if on some pre-arranged signal, all 3 bolted in the same moment, vanishing before Brogan could ask them anything else. Multiple ghosts, not just one. But he hadn't heard or seen anything to be able to say his house was haunted. Except for the erased chalk marks, which were just plain puzzling. Only a fellow shoemaker would know how much work they'd undone, and those boys were too young to be learning a trade yet. The ghost of the old shoemaker who'd lived here before then, Brogan decided. A man who didn't want another to take over his shop. "I won't be driven out by the ghost of a dead man," Brogan said softly, so no one outside would hear him talking to himself. "You hear me, ghost? This was your shop, but it's mine now. Someone must make shoes for the king now you're gone. Why not me?" He grinned at his own daring, hoping he was right and one day he would make shoes for royalty, just like his predecessor. In the meantime, he'd outfox his opponent. Instead of chalking all the outlines at once, he only did a sheet or 2 at a time, cutting them out before taking the chalk to a new sheet of leather. It was slower, but he managed to cut half his leather before the day ended. On the morrow, his shears and chalk disappeared. Brogan searched the house from top to bottom, but they were nowhere to be found. Swearing roundly about ghosts who wouldn't give up, he ventured out to buy new to replace what had been stolen. By the end of the 3rd day, he had enough leather cut to craft a dozen pairs of the best boots, with a little leather left over that he thought might make shoes for a child. Smiling, Brogan stretched out on his pallet in the loft for some well-earned rest.